Hello folks and welcome to this week's edition of DoubleDown, the live online news and affairs programme that puts people first. It's Thursday the 15th of April 2021. We're broadcasting live from Dundalk, Dublin, Longford and Derry tonight. And I am your host Finbar Markey, and you're also joined by our other host Anna Kavanagh. Thanks for tuning in this evening, folks. As usual, we're going to have a very busy lineup, if not a super busy lineup this evening. We're going to be talking with Independent Republican Councillor Gary Donnelly and pro-union community worker and cultural representative Brian Dougherty about the recent street violence in the north of Ireland. We're also going to be asking our viewers to send an email or two to a politician or two on behalf of little Ava Twomey. And our popular citizens journalist Anna Kavanagh will join the dots on news and events over the week. But first, let's take a look at some of the news that you won't see on TV. In Irish news first, and despite the pandemic and record unemployment, the price of the average home continues to skyrocket throughout the state. The Central Statistics Office has released figures showing that up to year end February 2021, there was an overall increase of 3% in the price of an average home throughout Ireland. When the figures are further broken down, the average home price in Dublin has risen by 1.2% and 4.7% outside of Dublin. Outside the capital, the house price increase is 4.3%, while apartment prices were up 9.6%. Since 2012, property prices have almost doubled in the Irish Republic. In more Irish news, much of the mainstream media, the papers and the TV news sources have today been trumpeting the agreement yesterday by Cabinet to the terms of reference of a commission to examine the possibility of a living wage into the future in Ireland. The living wage, thought to be on average around €12.30 in Ireland at the moment, is a set guaranteed wage calculated to meet the cost of living. The living wage is different from the minimum wage, which does not take into account inflation. Although there has been little cross-party criticism of the move, it does appear to be one of the many announcements being made by government over the last 10 years that have in the end come to nothing. Recent government announcements and changes indicate that the cost of living is already too high for most working families and families relying on social welfare, but the cost of living is set to increase dramatically again with tax increases, PUP repayments, an end to pandemic mortgage and rent relief, increasing housing costs, to name but a few hikes. The government's latest pronouncements on the living wage seems more and more like another meaningless PR exercise to mask the economic realities facing Ireland into the near future. Staying with Ireland, Vera Twomey is in our news again this week, with the distraught mother of four sending an open letter to the Taoiseach Micheál Martin and the Minister of Health Stephen Donnelly. In the letter, Mrs Twomey called for fair treatment for herself and other families that require cannabis-based medications but that cannot afford upfront payments. In the letter she said, and I quote, "Ava is one of a fortunate few whose cost of medicine is reimbursed by the cumbersome and difficult system where families have to pay out many thousands of euros in advance, often up to €10,000 every 3 months, and then wait sometimes for many weeks to have the HSE refunded." We will be looking at this story in a bit more detail and maybe trying to help the situation for Ava Twomey later on in this programme. Looking at developments with the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, also known as CETA, in response to a question from TD Jennifer Whitmore, Tánaiste Leo Varadkar last January cited government economic analysis to the effect that CETA would bring substantial benefits to Ireland. In preparation for his presentation to the Dáil Committee on European Affairs, due to scrutinise CETA in response to the Green Party's split on the issue, Dr Oisín Suttle of Maynooth University sought a copy of the advice cited by Mr Varadkar through a Freedom of Information application. But Dr Suttle has been refused the information as it is, according to the state, not in the public interest to disclose it. The information requested by Dr Suttle is the key evidence underpinning the government's urgency in seeking ratification by the Oireachtas of CETA. But with such evidence withheld, the question remains, how can Green Party TDs and ministers change their mind and agree to a deal when their call for greater scrutiny has in effect been ignored? And we will follow that story as it develops. Birdwatch Ireland's annual scientific journal has revealed that more birds than ever before are now red listed on the island of Ireland. A recent report in the organisation's annual review says that a total of 54 Irish bird species, or 26% of all species, are now on the red list, indicating that the highest status of concern for their populations. Since 2013, another 23 species have moved onto this red list, including the kestrel, the puffin and the razorbill. In international news, New Mexico is the 7th state in the United States to legalize cannabis possession, with Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham signing the statute into law this week. State legislators and civil rights groups have praised the decriminalization of possession of the herb, claiming that the change will end the criminalization of many people and weaken drug cartels in New Mexico. It's also expected to bring in billions of dollars in investment and jobs. And finally, the United States moves closer to a war footing in Europe. William Burns, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, told the US Senate on Wednesday that Russia had amassed sufficient military forces and equipment on the border of Ukraine to allow Russian incursion into the country. Mr. Burns expressed serious concerns over the ongoing Russian military buildup in the Crimea and Donbass region over the past 4 weeks. Mr. Burns has, however, ignored the continued military buildup of Ukrainian forces on the border, forces that are financed by the US using US arms. Ukrainian forces have increased attacks on independent Donbass regions since President Biden's inauguration. Recent footage has emerged purported to be Ukrainian weaponry on the way to the Russian border. I think we could roll that footage. I think we have a clip of it. So that seems to be some serious military hardware, much of it coming from the United States. And when the United States is talking about giving military aid to Ukraine in its defense against Russia, it's actually selling, and these are arms deals that are being done. Massive amounts of weapons forming on the Russian border. That's all the news that you won't see on TV this week, folks. I would like to just spend an extra minute or two focused on the Ava Twomey, Vera Twomey story that's developed over the last few weeks. As you may recall, Vera Twomey has campaigned tirelessly for her daughter Ava, who suffers from seizures, very severe and life-threatening seizures. The only thing that really stops those seizures is a cannabis-based medication. And Vera campaigned for years to have this medication or some form of cannabis medication made legal and available to families like Vera's family in Ireland. She was successful in this campaign with the assistance of many other people, but Vera really led that campaign and was the face of that campaign. So now her daughter Ava can get access to this medication, and it's really working for her. The problem that they have now is that they can't afford the upfront payments for the medication, which sometimes works out at over €3,000 per month or €10,000 per quarter of a year, unaffordable to the mass majority of families in this country. There has been a Twitter campaign that Vera and other people have been driving called #TalkToVera, and this has been aimed at Taoiseach Micheál Martin and also Stephen Donnelly, the Minister for Health. It would appear that things are moving very, very slowly, and Ava's family and the other children's families just can't afford this medication anymore. This is a serious matter. It's not a case that Vera is asking for legislation to be changed or anything like that. The pre-funding of this medication can be done overnight with the stroke of a pen. And so we're asking our viewers this evening, and any viewers who'll watch this over the next week or two, to please email Micheál Martin and email Stephen Donnelly, so that's the Department of Health and the Department of the Taoiseach, politely asking them to not only talk to Vera, but to do a deal for this medication to be prepaid. It's not a massive amount of money compared to the pay rises and everything else that the politicians have been giving themselves over the last 12 months. And it's nothing compared to the money that's been spent on the pandemic so far. It's pittance compared to that. So we're asking people, you'll see in the box, in the chat box there, you'll see email addresses for Micheál Martin, email addresses for Stephen Donnelly, and also for the departments. And we're asking you in a polite, mannerly way to send those emails and put a bit of pressure on their departments to make something happen. Now, I have heard that one of the excuses over the last few days from the Taoiseach and from Stephen Donnelly has been that it's up to the HSE and that they're a little bit nervous about agreeing to this, even though they do it for lots of other medications already. Well, what we're saying is whether it's the HSE, whether it's the Department of Health, whether it comes out of Micheál Martin and Stephen Donnelly's big pay packets, we don't care. We want this prepaid and we want it done in the next week or two. So those emails are in the chat box. Copy them, send emails off, do it daily if you have to. Let's fill up their inboxes until we can get some action and we get settlement for Ava and for Vera Twomey. Vera Twomey and Ava have been on this road for so many years. It's about time they can just sit back, relax, and have a sense that their fight is now over. And it's terrible to see any mother having to go online and go on social media to plead what should be naturally organised for them anyway. So that's all I'd like to say about that. Anna Kavanagh, before we go on to speak to our guests, Gary Donnelly and Brian Dougherty, about the situation up in the north of Ireland at the moment, Anna Kavanagh will be talking to us later and joining the dots on some of the relevant news stories that maybe are not getting the attention that they deserve. Are you there, Anna?
I'm certainly here, Finbar, and I have to say that last week you definitely took me out of my comfort zone. So the response that I got to my news item last week was, oh, for the love of God, Anna, say it and don't take the whole night saying it. So I hope to be a little bit better prepared tonight and be able to present a roundup of this week's news more succinctly. I'll be picking up on one or two of the points that you made there, particularly on the area of housing. I'll be looking at the environment and other matters then that came to my attention during the week.
Okay, well, I look forward to that. We'll be talking to the guys for the next 20 minutes to half an hour, to Brian Dougherty and to Gary Donnelly. And then if you want to have a wee natter with them yourself, Anna, and then we'll move over to your segment, and I'm really looking forward to it. I actually thought you were great last week. I thought it was really organised, and you really did join those dots very well. So I'm looking forward to your segment at near the end of the show as well. Moving over to our next subject or topic matter. If you're looking at the mainstream media, you think that the situation in Northern Ireland had collapsed completely and that there was just fires and riots all over the province of Ulster. I don't think that's completely true. I think there's probably a certain amount of dramatisation, but there has been an increase in the level of street violence conducted within pro-union communities, and there is, I suppose, good reason to at least discuss this matter with people who are really involved in it in the centre and who are in those communities and who are chosen community representatives. So once more, we're joined tonight by Councillor Gary Donnelly, an Independent Republican Councillor from Derry, and Brian Dougherty, who is a representative of the North West Cultural Partnership, but also is a community worker in and around Derry in pro-union community areas. Welcome to the show, lads.
Hi, Finbar.
And Gary, do you want to take off your mute there? Have you got mute on?
That's us.
Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you, Finbar.
You're probably getting sick of my invitations at this stage.
Oh no. Welcome now.
I introduced this show, guys. I'm losing a bit of my focus there, I noticed. I introduced this show asking the question, is what is being reported coming out of Northern Ireland over the last few weeks, is it as serious as some of the media are portraying? Is it as widespread and things like that? Just to get stuck into it, has there been any trouble or any street violence in your communities? Maybe we could start off with Brian. Have you noticed it in and around Derry at all?
Yeah, Finbar, it's been was quite serious within Londonderry, particularly the Waterside. In fact, I suppose the whole domino effect started in the state quite close to where I live and where I used to work in the mid-90s, and in Tullyalley, and it created a bit of a domino effect that spread kind of more seriously, I think, to across the waterside, but then to Belfast, which is quite unusual because being a minority community in the city here, it's usually been the case historically and traditionally that unionism would take their lead from what happens in Belfast. But for some strange reason this time, or for reasons we'll probably go into later on, the violence actually was sparked here in the waterside.
Okay, and were you out communicating with anybody in the community over the last few weeks about this? We'll go into more detail later, but just to get an overview of where you're at in Derry at the moment. Yeah,
well, not just myself, but I have a number of colleagues in the Londonderry Bands Forum and Northwest Cultural Partnership, Derek Moore, who have had on here before, others, James Key. We're lucky enough to have quite a strong constituent base within the communities where the violence started, so we were able to get access to key individuals and key community workers there quite readily, and also to other statutory bodies, including the PSNI as well, and other organisations that we thought it would be useful to engage with to try and help resolve the issue.
Okay, and Gary, has any of this moved over into your community? Have you had a taste of any of this over the last few weeks?
Well, there has been violence in the community where I come from. It has been a different type of violence. There have been a number of very heavy-handed PSNI raids, at which a number of people were beaten with batons, and one was hospitalised with a number of stitches. There was a woman who was assaulted by 4 police officers who wrestled the ground and handcuffed her, and that resulted in a bit of a mini riot. And the PSNI came under fairly broad criticism by the community and some politicians. In fact, there was a motion passed in Derry City and Strabane District Council calling for human rights groups to investigate the PSNI behaviour. That was approximately a week before planned Easter Rising commemorations, which there was a fear that could result in violence, but it turned out relatively peaceful after the PSNI were persuaded to stay away. There were some minor disturbances in our nationalist area, particularly Galia, but it didn't escalate. And in regards to the Easter commemoration, the absence of a PSNI presence proved that that their presence at them are there to antagonise people, not protect people.
Okay. Somebody's just coming, a few people who've just joined the chat box, they're asking what the issue is. We're just discussing the recent street violence in the north of Ireland for anybody who's just joined the programme. We would ask viewers if you could like and share this programme now and get this independent media spread out around the country and get people inside and outside of Ireland watching, because it is the only real free media. Our guests are free to say whatever they want in a respectful way to each other. You won't see that anywhere else, especially on the television. So like and share the program right now, guys, and let's start having proper in-depth discussions that result in something more than bitterness and anger between individuals and communities. Just to move on to the next question, guys, I've seen some media reports describe the street violence over the last few weekends as sudden, as unexpected. Gary, maybe to kick off on this, do you think this is sudden and unexpected, or?
I don't, Finbar. We coming up to Brexit, we had a number of, I think particularly the Free State government and our people were using the threat of violence. They sort of set the tone in a lot of this. The tone of the politics at the time of this violence, there was a lot of, and I'm talking about in the 6 counties now, there was a lot of aggressive rhetoric and the usual sort of sectarianism and divisiveness of Stormont politics, the traditional sort of peddling of fear. Things were obviously building towards of a reaction of some sort. And I think that this violence is simply a reflection of the failure of the political system in this part of part of Ireland. Having engaged with stakeholders within the pro-union communities, it was clear that that there was a growing sense of dissatisfaction for months previous to this, and I believe that what contributed there was a lack of leadership from political unionism, and their sort of saber rattling led to contributed to the reasons for this violence. And, unfortunately, this is the same sort of political unionism that has vowed to abandon them if this violence or if this rioting sort of fails.
Okay, so it doesn't come as a big surprise out of the blue to you. Brian, is it a big surprise to you? I know that I recall that when we were speaking before on this subject about Brexit and things like that, you did express that some people were not necessarily happy with the outcome, but you didn't think that it would result in significant violence. And I don't think there has been significant violence, and we will come on to that. But are you surprised at the kick in the shins that's been given?
Not. I mean, whenever, as you said, I was referring to kind of unlikely return to the level of violence we had during the Troubles. I mean, I still don't think that we were anywhere near that, but I was slightly surprised that it kicked off when it did, but not surprised given the process, some of which Gary outlined. It does go back to to 2016 to the Brexit decision and this kind of attack almost on British identity or sense of identity. Since that, there's been a huge swathe of anti-British rhetoric and narrative coming from all circles, really, from mainstream media, from academia, from political opportunists and political commentators, which has kind of led to the sense of unionism having to try and re-establish its identity or almost apologise for its identity. So it's been evolving for 4 years, and then I suppose in the last few weeks we've started to hit almost the perfect storm, because I think I mentioned in a previous session here, there's been other elements that have really created a pretty toxic soup mix. We had, I suppose, the political leadership that Gary refers to, and I suppose it's not really, I suppose, initiated by kind of the fear factor from political unionism. This is as much to do with as a reaction to the lack of political leadership within unionism. So most of what was happening within the lawless communities has really been intra-community tension, and a reaction to the sense that our local elected leadership, our leadership at Westminster, has kind of led us up the garden path and has let us down. We also then had a few... Could you
elaborate just on that before you move on from that, Brian? Because what I'm hearing from that is that there's no political representation for working class people in loyalist communities. Is that essentially what you're...
Absolutely. I mean, we have just completed a major piece of research for London Dairy Bands Forum, and for example, one of the questions we asked in a quite extensive household survey in loyalist areas and Derry was how effective they saw their political leadership, their elected political leadership, and only 19%, 1 in 5, said that they saw their elected leadership as being effective or very effective. So and that was right across the board from a couple of the areas where the violence kicked off, like Nelson Drive, but even in rural areas and right across the Derry Strabane District Council area. So that lack of local leadership has had a huge impact in creating the powder keg and the frustration that erupted into violence. And as well as that, obviously, we've had to say a few local decisions. The centenary, or the decision by council before Christmas not to corporately support the centenary celebrations was also seen as a kick in the teeth to local unionism. We've had 2 other issues as well, I think, that have been really important. Obviously, how the protocol played out and how it's been played out, but also the fact that the PPS decision around the Bobby Story funeral two weeks ago, I think, was the straw that broke the camel's back, because there has been a huge amount of disillusionment with how the police conduct themselves within unionist areas as well. And one other key factor, and probably the key factor, which particularly came across whenever we were speaking to young people in the areas affected, was the realisation that we've been 13 months in lockdown, and within that you have a lot of kind of local community structures that haven't met in 13 months. For example, we had a young fella in one of the states, Tully Alley, it said to us, that their local band, their marching band, hasn't paraded or hasn't even practiced in 13 months, and usually they practice once or twice a week. And had they been in the band hall practicing, all the young people who were on the streets rioting in Tully Alley would have been in the band hall instead. And it's not just the band structure; it's sporting clubs, football clubs, cricket clubs, where that influence and that structure, that camaraderie, and influence from leaders hasn't been there. And so whenever you have the opportunity, however fickle it might be, once that opportunity happens to get involved in almost recreational violence, and it's a very attractive proposition for a young teenager. Not to say that this is where it really came from. There were people above that who were I suppose involved in organising that violence, and they were, I suppose, more concerned about the kind of the toxic mix of 5 issues that kind of came together in the perfect storm 2 weeks ago to air that frustration.
So there's just so many things there. The social issues, there's the natural energy in young people that you mentioned that's been suppressed by the pandemic regulations and all of what might be perceived as true. But one thing that stands out to me there, because I've seen it on both sides, Brian, recently, is the sense that within some elements of the pro-union community, that the PSNI, the police force, are erring towards being more favourable to the nationalist community. Did I get that clear? Did I pick that up right from you? That there's a sense that there's a bias towards the nationalist community from the police service?
I don't think it's necessarily a bias, but what's happened, I mean, I was a member of the very first Northern Ireland Policing Board in 2001, which was set up after the Patton recommendations, and it was quite a deliberate strategic decision at that time by both the board and by the strategic command within the PSNI to divert more resources into nationalist areas in a way to try and sell this idea of community policing within nationalist areas, because at that time, if you remember, it was an almost entirely Protestant police force, and at that time in the early 2000s, Sinn Féin didn't even endorse policing and weren't members of the policing board, so it was a very conscious decision to sell the idea of community policing to those areas. And what happened in the 20 years since has been that disconnect from within unionist communities and the police. Because you've got to remember, prior to Patton, most of the police service was from the Protestant community. I have family members who were in the PSNI, they lived within the unionist communities as well. So all of a sudden, that connection was taken away. And largely within the unionist community, the police are supported, and people are welcome because they do see them as an important part of normal civic society in terms of reducing crime and everything. And so if you see an increase in crime, an increase in antisocial behaviour within Protestant areas because the police aren't there, then obviously there's a disillusionment. So then if you fast forward then 20 years, you now have a generation coming through who haven't had that same level of connection with the PSNI. So young people are starting to see the police the same way as maybe young nationalists have as well, in terms of them being part of the state forces, part of authority, part of discipline. So that connection, there was always a sense that that those relationships need to be rebuilt. And even 2 weeks ago as well, whenever the trouble kicked off, I mean, there has been examples of where the police have worked well in communities. Some communities in Londonderry didn't have any violence because they worked very well as a community, but also with the police. But what happened was there was an inconsistency with the PSNI, that they worked quite closely with us in the first weekend, but then kind of all contact was broken off. And on the Monday morning, the local district commander then kind of criticised local community leaders for not doing enough to quell the violence, despite the fact that his officers and community workers had been working over the weekend. So there's certainly an issue there, and how it played out over the 2 weeks as well was dangerous and consistent, because we heard of one example of a young fella who'd put his neck on the line in terms of working or ensuring or telling the young people that police should be taking a less heavy-handed approach and would be more discreet in how they policed the areas. And then the next night came in with the Land Rovers and everything else. So that young person was made to look foolish. So there's a lot of issues operationally, but also strategically in terms of how the police should be operating.
I think maybe to a degree the middle class nature of the police forces globally might be starting to really show itself in all areas in the province. Gary, before I ask you about what you think the causes of the trouble over the last few weeks have been, would you like to speak to anything that Brian has just said?
Yeah, just look, I can't deny or wouldn't deny that the PSNI do treat working class people within the loyal community, very poorly. I think, that they have failed all working class communities. It's not in their interest. they're there for a reason, and it's certainly not the protect working class community. So I think that the PSNI, by and large, as any type of sort of police force, are a failure.
Okay, and what do you think the causes of the recent street violence in certain parts of the north? Because it isn't as to the extent that some of the reporting might suggest it is. But what do you think that the causes have been?
Well, look, if we're talking about the recent violence in loyalist working class areas, I don't think it would be best placed to say sort of who or what elements of loyalism are behind these disturbances. It's probably a matter best placed to be dealt with from somebody from that community. I can't be certain, as no one's claiming responsibility, but it would be my analysis that when we have any type of perceived momentum in a sort of pro-sovereignty way or equality, it's seen by loyalism. It's viewed by loyalism in a negative fashion, and unfortunately, this usually manifests itself in acts of violence. And them acts of violence are used to sort of dampen that momentum. I think that there is a realization within loyalism that the Tories are happy to throw unionism under the sort of proverbial bus, and that results in growing feelings of isolation and frustration.
Okay. But ultimately, the mechanics of it, the dynamism, you wouldn't be prepared to try to, because we are hearing lots of stories that in the papers. Oh, this is about drug gangs. It's the drug gangs covering themselves politically. Brian, you're shaking your head there. Do you want to speak to that claim that's made in some of the media?
No, I mean, as you indicated yourself, and I think Gary indicated too, there's certainly no evidence of that. I mean, I think what's really important to point out here as well, Finbar, that this is very much an intra-unionist issue, an issue within loyalism. I mean, there's certainly been no hostility towards the nationalist community or Republican community. In fact, we would see a great number of parallels. I mean, I referred to the research we carried out recently, and exactly the timing was incredible, because a lot of what our recommendations and conclusions came to, and Gary contributed to the research as well, as almost coming to fruition. What we've found happening is something that really has been happening within nationalist communities for maybe 5-10 years, and that's a kind of three-tiered kind of power structure within communities now in Northern Ireland. At the top, you have a political leadership that has taken over virtually the community sector in the cities here, and I know that they've become integral to how which were previously independent community organisations.
Would you just explain that, be a bit more clear about it? Are you talking about Sinn Féin and the DUP getting involved?
I'll give kind of an example from the unionist community at the moment. Or it's not just DUP; it's also Unionist Party and other unionist parties as well are having a much more active role within the community sector in loyalist areas, whereas before they kept very much a hands-off approach because they saw us as communists and a threat to their own power base. But now they've recognised the importance of almost kind of bandwagon jumping on a lot of community projects. So a lot of them are involved heavily in mainstream community groups, be they chairpersons, members of committees, in some cases even members of the workers themselves, or maybe members of the political parties, and then that's helped create a disconnect between the communities as well, because there's then organisations or individuals within Protestant communities that don't align to that particular political view have become even more disconnected. And so there's a kind of like a three-tiered approach. You have the political leadership at the top, you have the community infrastructure in the middle, and then you have the disenfranchised bodies, including loyalist bands, including bonfire groups, including sporting clubs in many instances. We don't fit into the mainstream. And that, and Gary, I'm sure we've spoken about this many times before, a similar process has happened within republicanism as well, in terms of how Sinn Féin have kind of taken over much of the kind of professional community sector there, and that's manifested itself in disparate groups as well, and dissident groups. And I suppose the challenge for us as unionists. We've seen that process evolve and deepen within nationalist areas. Our concern now, or our challenge now, as Protestant workers and other leaders, is to ensure that chasm doesn't become so wide that these disparate groups within unionism resort to the same level of violence we've seen elsewhere in nationalist areas.
Okay, Gary, do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, I think what's happened is that the DUP have caught on to Sinn Féin tactics and regarding the importance of the whole community and voluntary sector. It can be a very lucrative financially sector. There's a lot of, within nationalist areas, there's a lot of gatekeeping. It's a very important for votes in that. And unfortunately, when that becomes involved, it doesn't do what it was set out to do. But I would also, see the whole issue regarding the drugs. Now, again, I'm not the best placed person, but I would be highly suspicious of such narratives. These claims are designed to discredit what, even in the eyes of loyalists, it could be legitimate concerns or grievances. We sort of frequently hear similar narratives from the state regarding Republicans, and more often than not, it's simply the outworking of felon setting or criminalisation of legitimate political movements. I have no doubt that there is a strong link between pro-union paramilitaries and the illegal drug trade, but if you look at areas where that is particularly, the allegations of that, like in East Belfast and South East Antrim, during the recent violence, them areas seem to be particularly quiet. I could be wrong about that. That's my perception. And I do believe that the current political unrest within loyalist areas is far more strategic and political, which in my view is potentially more dangerous.
Okay, Brian, this is very strategic according to Gary. Do you see an element of tactician, that this is tactic and strategy, or?
I don't. I mean, if you were a drug dealer and you were looking to use a tactic to
not necessarily a drug dealer. I think what Gary is saying is that within the leadership itself of loyalism, that this is a tactic, a wee kick in the shin, as it were, to say, look at us, we're being ignored.
Yeah, it's more that, because if as I say, just to finish the point I was going to make earlier on, that if you were a drug, or trying to use this as a diversion to drug activity, the last thing you'd want was to bring more police into the area. So I don't think there's any real connection with that, or even specifically with loyalist paramilitaries, because, as I say, this has been building up for a long time, and the young people, the range of people who were involved in this disturbance is, there's ranging from 10, 12-year-olds to kind of teenagers to adults and people of my generation. So it's a collective frustration, and as I say, I've always used the analogy that, the Protestant people tend to keep their heads down and stare at their feet until they're poked to a certain point of time. That rubber band, that elastic band stretches, and eventually it does snap. And as I indicated earlier on, that's really what's happening after 4 years of this sense of cultural decline and threats to national identity and all the 5-6 points I made earlier on. Eventually that is going to snap, and that's right across the board, because whereas the vast majority of people don't want to see violence and didn't want to see violence, the same frustrations are still there. People understand and people realise why they happened, and the fact that, I suppose, the big frustration from us now going forward is the condescending attitude of the political leadership, who basically denigrated the communities where they started as if there was some kind of underbelly. In fact, whenever we were doing the research again, one of the political leaders we spoke to referred to the bonfire groups and the band groups, or these disparate groups, as the underbelly of their society. So it's very convenient for them to use terminology like that to really mask their own inadequacy, and say that's the main problem. The main frustration.
I think to be saying that publicly on the eve of an election, for instance, I think to be very much talking in favour of bonfires in the working class communities. Anyway, it's the nature of politicians. I want to clear up some stuff, because there's lots of bullshit flying around in relation to what's happening at the moment. Stories about Catholics being purged out housing estates in Cork, Fergus, for instance. Is there any reality in this? You guys are on the ground there. Could you clarify what's happening there? Maybe Gary, do you want to?
Finbar, look, I don't know all the details other than what's put out on the media about other parts of the 6 counties. I have an immense distrust of the media, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was the position. Now, I can speak certainly locally. I have first-hand knowledge of some Catholic families leaving or intending to leave due to the recent trouble. Now, they weren't directly targeted by violence, but I suppose the proximity of it to their homes has led to a sense of fear and insecurity, meaning that, you know, that they sort of feel that it would be safer for them and their families to relocate. But what I will say is that the very essence of the 6 county state is sectarianism. You know, I don't think we can get away from the fact that it was founded on it, and it is indeed the lifeblood of it. You know, and in my opinion, that the only way to end sectarianism is to end the 6 county state.
Okay, and we're going to move on to that in a wee minute. Brian, is there any veracity or any fact that you're aware of to those claims? Because they're very, very serious claims, and I'm concerned that, you know, it's the north of Ireland. You can't trust anybody. You know, those claims could be put out by any side, from British military intelligence to Sinn Féin to somebody. You know what I mean? It's just hard to tell. So, have you any idea what's happened with regards to that?
Yeah, I mean, like Gary, I can't speak for outside the city here, but I mean, certainly, I mean, I'd be surprised, because I mean, the water side now, the dynamics in the water side have changed dramatically. I mean, I live in what is a loyalist heartland in the water side here, and I know of at least 3 Catholic families who live within 20 yards of me. You know, most of the water side now is mixed. We were all aware of the Protestant exodus from the 70s to 2000, particularly after Bloody Sunday, when 15,000 Protestants were forced into the water side, and more recently out to the suburbs. And I mean, I hope I'm not being disingenuous here now, but I mean, the population movements of Catholic families to the water side has been immense in the last number of years. It's almost been a nationalist population exodus from the West Bank to the East Bank, largely because of the increase in antisocial behaviour and trouble within nationalist areas. We thankfully haven't seen the same level of violence in the water side that other parts of the city have, and I'm pretty certain, you know, that most areas now in the water side have some degree of diversity and mixing. And personally, in the 4 or 5 areas we've spoken to and worked with in the water side here in the last couple of weeks, we haven't heard any inkling of intimidation or people have been forced out. In fact, the communities themselves would be horrified and aghast at the very thought of it, and it would be very protective to ensure it didn't happen. That's
exactly what I was going to put to you next. How do you think your community would react to those kind of threats if they ever did? And let's make clear for the viewers that we are not saying those threats have occurred, but we're saying that they have been reported as occurring. And I'm just asking the question, how do you think, Brian, your community would respond?
Yeah, well, I mean, the water side, I mean, and this is no reflection of Gary or anybody from the Catholic community, but the city side is 99% Catholic. The water side is much more diverse. I mean, there's Polish families live here, there's coloured families live here, there's Chinese families from right across the world, and Catholic families as well. And I think the water side are quite proud of that. You know, and as I indicated earlier on, I'd be aghast. I know personally families would be aghast if Protestant population would be aghast and go out of their way to ensure that no such intimidation happened, and no such intimidation for anyone, because you've got to remember this violence too impacted greatly on the elderly within our community and other families as well. And you know, so I mean, there was a broad consensus that this had to stop because it was impacting terribly on local residents and families from all ages and all demographics and all backgrounds.
Okay. Just in relation to, because we are getting tight on time, I was going to throw out the general question there. Do you think that the Good Friday Agreement is working? I think that's a programme in itself, I suppose, isn't it? But just off the cuff, maybe 1 or 2 sentences. Do you think that the Good Friday Agreement is working in the context of what we've seen over the last few weeks? Maybe we'd start off with Gary in that one.
Look, the Good Friday Agreement or Belfast Agreement, it means different things to different people. Look, I think it has failed in every political sense. It has failed to end violence, and in Republican terms, it has failed to restore sovereignty, and build a lasting peace. My view on the Good Friday Agreement, it was the latest tactic in British counter-democratic process, like its predecessor, the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And the next one, which is a British legislated border poll, the Good Friday Agreement, has been a complete and utter failure.
Brian, not just with regards to what's happened with street violence, but just in terms of where a lot of pro-union people feel they are at the moment, do you think that the Good Friday Agreement is working for them?
No, I mean, one of the key slogans that's emerged on the walls here in the last 2 or 3 weeks is the deal's dead or the deal's off. And I mean, so I agree a lot. I agree with Gary's analysis of the Good Friday Agreement, maybe for slightly different reasons. But I mean, I think operationally, I mean, I suppose in terms of the core elements of how Stormont works, it's very difficult to run an effective government where there's no opposition. And if you're trying to get two political parties at polar opposites in terms of their political ideology, trying to agree on even the most basic issue, it's always doomed for failure. And then below that, I mean, as an institution operationally, it's cumbersome, it's inefficient, and it's ineffective. I mean, it's almost impossible to get infrastructural projects done. I mean, we talk about lack of resources coming here from Westminster, but every March, tens of thousands and millions are sent back to Westminster because the Stormont government are incapable of actually spending the money or getting around to spend the money. So at the various levels, I think it needs a complete overhaul.
Okay. Someone who's just in the comment box has been asking what you guys would think of a United Ireland. We have covered that discussion in detail in a number of other programmes with our guests tonight and other guests. We will put the link into that in the comment box for anybody who wants to look at those programmes for earlier in the year. If Good Friday, you both agree Good Friday is not working, or Belfast Agreement, whatever we may call it, if it's not working, does that mean that we're facing violence into the future? What does it mean? What's the solution to it if Good Friday is not working? Brian, do you want to hit us up on that maybe?
Oh, my response isn't going to go down too well, but I'm an advocate of direct rule. I think the country's has been run far more effectively in recent years, particularly whenever the Stormont government has been suspended. So.
Okay, Gary? I presume that you're not in favour of direct London rule anyway. And if you are, it's breaking news, folks.
No, well, look, direct rule has failed. The only alternative is democracy and elect a national government and allow the people of Ireland to determine their own affairs and their own future without external impediment.
Okay. Final question. How do you think things are going to play out over the coming year in terms of, on the one hand, we have recognised tonight that there was some street violence, that there is building pressures that are not just related to Brexit and that, but are related to stuff like this pandemic regulations and economic pressures as well. Based on the notion that Brexit ain't going to be changed now, this concept of a sea border is there, and perception of it's not going to change probably either. Based on that, maybe starting off with Brian, where do you think we're heading over the next year?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think the EU themselves have to take responsibility on how the protocol is playing out. I think they're playing the part of a kind of crab divorcee at the moment with the British, and putting obstacles in the way, administrative obstacles and bureaucratical obstacles, which they aren't imposing on other non-EU countries. So I think a lot of common sense needs to come into that to help resolve the protocol issue, because I agree with yourself. I don't think the protocol is going to change or isn't going to go away. We need to use a bit of common sense in terms of resolving that. I think from the Unions Committee, what this has done, if there is one glimmer of light coming out of the violence in the last couple of weeks, it's been a jolt. I think that local communities political leadership in Westminster and in Dublin and other countries and EU particularly weren't aware of. So I think going forward now, what we need to be doing is ensuring that investment is made in the right areas. And by investment, I don't mean necessarily financial investment, but investment in time and in dialogue and bringing those disparate groups, those groups that are outside kind of the mainstream that have, that are airing their frustration need to be brought into the table, need to be brought into the mainstream community and voluntary sector, need to be brought into the political decision making, and that's going to take a lot of time in terms of building those relationships and making sure that going forward those people do feel they have a voice. And because if they don't, then this is going to just go round in circles, and there's going to be another spark of violence soon, I would imagine.
Okay, and Gary, where do you think this is going?
Well, I think, protocol or no protocol happened as a result of direct rule. Do you know what I mean? Whatever happens here within a partitioned Ireland, it's not going to work. The last century has told us that. And I think the next year, it could be a difficult one. There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of agendas at play. And unfortunately, Ireland is but a mere pawn to be played by the great and the good. And, I think we need to resist that and not get sucked into that, because, what's going to happen is that it's our families, our children, our grandchildren who will suffer. And I think that we should not allow that. We have to do everything in our power to make sure that, and we're not, our grandchildren don't suffer the failure of another generation. Politics on this island has let everyone down, and I think we need to sit down, have a mature dialogue about where we're at, where we're going, and how best to get there. And I would appeal to the unionists, particularly working class unionists, to come together and work with the people who live on this island as a whole and build a better future, because then they will be real stakeholders and on the island, instead of this loyalty to an imperialist establishment that they can never and never ever will trust.
Okay. Do you want to add anything to that as a final comment before I give Brian an opportunity for a final comment? You're happy with that, Gary?
Yeah.
You're happy with that? Brian, do you want to make any final comments?
No, I mean, I think what's been pretty clear, I think, even from speaking to Gary over the years, or last couple of years, this is a lot more that unites us and divides us, particularly around social issues and local communities. And as indicated earlier on, what has happened in the last couple of weeks has just been a mirror image of what was happening within republicanism in terms of that, peripherality and sense of hopelessness and not having an effective voice. So I think we could probably learn a lot from each other in terms of how we make sure that everyone is engaged going forward.
Okay, Councillor Gary Donnelly, Brian Dougherty of the Northwestern Cultural Partnership. Once more, thanks for joining us. The feedback that we get when you guys come on every week, and this isn't to blow you up or anything, but the feedback that we get is that there's far more reasonable and balanced discussion and respectful and in-depth discussion happens when you guys get together than you would normally see with politicians on TV and things like that. So I can give you feedback that our audience and the viewers do get something and do get greater understanding, I think, from you guys coming on than watching the sensationalist headlines that are going around the place about what's happening at the moment. I hope you will join us again over the next few weeks as things develop, and hopefully they won't develop too much over the next few weeks. Guys, thanks for joining us again, and be in contact if you need to tell us anything.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I'm always impressed. I feel that if these guys were running the place up in the north of Ireland, things might get sorted out a lot quicker. I'm not saying the major question would be sorted out, but in terms of just the quality of life in the north of Ireland would be a lot better. Like and share the programme if you think we're getting real news out there, if you think that we're a different and an independent space for people to speak and to express themselves in a reasonable and a respectful fashion. Anna Kavanagh has been hanging on there. I'm so sorry to run over time again, Anna. Anna, you want to join some dots on some recent news stories?
Yes, but before I delve into my news, I just wanted to pay huge tribute to Brian and Gary. It was just so edifying to listen to them speak. We're so used to mainstream media, everything just being so contentious, and nearly always ends in huge conflict and a huge row. And it was just a wonderful experience to see them tonight, as happened the previous night that you interviewed them, just engaging with each other, so respectful towards each other. And I had the pleasure of chatting to both of them offline before the programme began, and just so much respect that they have for each other. And I would just love if we could see more of that on mainstream media. I'm going to begin this week's news with a topic that has rarely been out of the headlines, both on radio, television and in newspapers this week. And of course, I'm speaking about vaccines, and now they're beginning to speak about vaccine passports. I suppose back in March 2020, we handed over our freedom, and it now looks as if our freedom is going to be given back to us on condition that we're vaccinated, and possibly that we will carry a COVID vaccine passport. And indeed, that is what is currently happening, where Denmark has become the first EU country where citizens carry a COVID vaccine passport, and they use that then to access shops and personal service. Now, the European Court of Human Rights ruled last week that vaccinations for children are necessary in a democratic society. The case involved several families from the Czech Republic whose children had been refused admission to school because they weren't fully vaccinated against a range of diseases, including measles, mumps, rubella and whooping cough. Nicholas Herview, a legal expert specialising in the European Court of Human Rights matters, said the ruling reinforces the possibility of compulsory vaccinations for COVID-19. And Dr. Gregor Popinik, who is the Director General of the European Centre for Law and Justice, this is a body that has consultative status at the UN. Popinik has been uncovering the financial ties between George Soros, Bill Gates and the Council of Europe, who in fact set up the European Court of Human Rights. The financial reports of the Council of Europe show, according to Popinik, that George Soros's Open Society and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are the two largest private donors to the organisation. And we mustn't forget that what happens in Europe, then it happens here in Ireland, because the two go hand in hand. And the acting Chief Medical Officer here in Ireland, Dr. Ronan Glynn, said last Monday at a press briefing for journalists that there's ongoing work at EU level around the development of a vaccine passport, and that Ireland is actually very involved in that process. He says, I think the EU has indicated that we're a number of weeks away from that at this point. So let's see how things develop over the coming weeks, but hopefully it will offer opportunities, he told reporters. Indeed, the EU took a step closer yesterday to introducing COVID vaccine passports. EU ambassadors representing 27 member states agreed a joint position on vaccine passports involving 5 key amendments. And indeed, the rollout of the COVID vaccine here in Ireland took a turn for the worst earlier this week, when the AstraZeneca vaccine was withdrawn for people under the age of 60. And this led to the HSE being forced into a U-turn. They issued a statement on Monday evening saying that student nurses and doctors who are not vaccinated can now take up their clinical placements. Now, the irony of this statement wasn't lost on Aontú Leader Padder Tobin, who tweeted, In February, the HSE said that the AstraZeneca is not for older people. In March, the HSE tells student nurses you must take the AstraZeneca vaccine or lose your placement and ultimately your career. And then in April, the HSE turns around and tells student nurses you can't take the AstraZeneca vaccine as it may not be safe for younger people. So it seems that there's no depth low enough to which these scientific advisors are prepared to sink. And we saw that earlier this week in an interview on RTE Radio 1. Professor Samuel McConkie told Claire Byrne that people that were going to a concert in Slane could sit on rugs. So we listen now to what he actually had to say to Claire Byrne.
This COVID thing, unfortunately, Claire, I believe is going to go on for 3 to 5 years. It's not there'll be no definitive solution, in 2 months' time. So it's something we have to find ways of existing in a happy, enjoyable, creative way. But I think it may involve new ways of doing music concerts where we're, maybe 10,000 people in Slane Castle spread out in the field with each one on a rug, and you're on your own rug and you're 2 meters from the next group's rug. But we could still enjoy some great outdoor music potentially in those newly envisaged venues. We also have to deal with keeping out new variants, and that's what we're doing now with all this quarantine and hospital mandatory hotel quarantine of people coming in, from high-risk countries. So this idea of getting it down, and keeping it out, that to me is the straightforward way of communicating what we need to do. In the past, we've been good at getting it down. We haven't been so good at keeping it down, and certainly up until recently, we haven't really tried seriously about keeping it out.
Okay, so I wonder how many young people will fancy spacing out 2 meters apart on rugs at a concert in Slane. And I might add that Professor McConkie is a member of ISAC, the Independent Scientist Advisory Group, and they were in the news recently, an expose by Gripped Media that they were using scare tactics to push their zero COVID strategy. Mr. McConkie is also a member of the European Vaccine Initiative, which is funded by the Gates Foundation. And so to news that is not vaccine related or COVID vaccine passport related. Almost €750 million was claimed by TDs for payments to family members and others, including €6,000 to an RTE comedy writer. Ministers, TDs and senators spent more than €6,747,000, which is just 76,000 short of €750 million, through a special allowance they can use for PR advice and secretarial assistance. Indeed, Fianna Fáil TD Andreas Moynihan paid his son, who's also called Andreas, a total of just under €10,000. Minister for Disabilities, Anne Rabbitte, paid out around €20,000 through the allowance, including a whopping €6,000 to the writer of the RTE comedy drama Can't Cope, Won't Cope. Stephanie Presnia just happens to be the fiancée of Minister Rabbitte's special advisor, Noel Byrne. Minister Rabbitte said that she hired Stephanie because everyone knows she's a great communicator, and she knows Stephanie could help her in her role as Minister for Disabilities to become a better communicator. So if we look at Professor McConkie and Minister Rabbitte, you'd have to ask the question, do they take the people to be complete, total and utter fools? And indeed, this is a theme that was taken up somewhat in mainstream media earlier this week in an article that appeared in the Irish Examiner. Daniel McConnell, the political editor, began his report in Monday's paper on the appointment of Robert Watt as the new Secretary-General at the Department of Health for a 5-year term. And I quote, "It is not hard to be cynical about politics and government affairs when those in charge of the running of our country continue to treat the public as idiots. The Cabinet is expected to sign off on the appointment of Robert Watt as the new Secretary-General at the Department of Health for a 5-year term. On January 6th, at the behest of the Health Minister Stephen Donnelly, the Taoiseach Micheál Martin announced to the Cabinet that Mr Watt was being transferred to health on an interim basis, and this was done without a Cabinet memo being tabled or without any discussion about the rate of pay for the full-time appointee to the job. Watt currently earns €211,000 a year and stands to have this increased to €292,000 a year, or a whopping €1.46 million over the term of his 5-year appointment. So let us now dig a little bit deeper about Mr Watt. And in 2019, he was Secretary-General of the Department of Public Expenditure. He was summoned before the Dáil Public Account Committee, where he faced sustained questioning about why his department only became involved in dealing with the cost overrun at the National Children's Hospital 3 months after the issue emerged. So we're going to watch a video clip now of Mr Watt when he appeared before the Dáil Public Account Committee, and he's been questioned here by Deputy Catherine Connolly. News had just broken in mainstream media earlier in the day that Mr Watt had referred to the PAC as a mob.
For the record. Mr Watt, you're very welcome, and your team are very welcome. I think it's most unacceptable that you refer to the committee as a mob. If you didn't, and that's been reported, perhaps you'll confirm that you're going to ask the reporter to withdraw that because it's not accurate.
So I've already addressed this.
No, sorry.
Deputy.
I'm asking a question.
I really feel
no,
this.
Mr Watt, sorry. As a member, I've a lot of questions I want to ask. To refer to the committee as a mob, if it's not correct, will you be issuing instructions for that to be changed? Or is it that you said it and you're apologising?
So I will talk to the journalist. I don't know who the journalist was. I don't know who, but I will speak with the journalist when I get a chance.
Did you hear my question, Mr Watt? Will you be talking to the journalist to say that was wrong and you didn't say that, or will you? Or are you apologising for saying it?
So I said already, through the chair, that if I said it, that I apologise for that, and that wasn't meant to be offensive in any way.
It is offensive to call a committee a mob. Níl sé ceart ná cór agus ní féidir glacu leis an focail gramasca úsáid maidiú leis an coiste seo. I'm not sure now. I'm not sure what your body language means, but I am here as a member to ask questions in the most polite manner possible and to get replies.
And I've answered questions, Deputy,
as
I have on many occasions.
I'm asking this question now, Mr Watt. I'm asking this question now, and I'm still not sure what you're saying. Did you use the word mob or did you not?
I don't have any recollection of what I said.
Okay.
That's my
well, let me put my questions in perspective on this. See, I'm from Galway City, and I welcome the plan.
You've been looking there at Robert Watt, the new head of the Department of Health, when he appeared before the Dáil Public Account Committee, and you can see his response to being held to account for his actions. And I just want you to bear in mind that this is the man who has been appointed by the government to steer the country out of COVID. And so now we move on to other matters. We're going to look at some environmental news now. And earlier this week, it was announced that the Russian-owned Othnish Alumina has secured approval from An Bord Pleanála for its plans for an extension of its large plant on the Shannon estuary near Foynes in County Limerick. and this is to be considered under the fast-track planning process for large strategic projects. It means that Europe's largest alumina plant can apply directly to the board for planning permission without having to apply to Limerick City and County Council. Atnish Alumina wants to increase the height of the large bauxite residue disposal area, which covers 450 acres, and it currently contains an estimated 50,000 tonnes of red mud, which you are looking at there in the photograph. And this, bear in mind, is on the banks of the River Shannon. And Kappa Farmers Group have waged a 30-year battle for environmental justice. And last year on the Irish Inquiry, we interviewed Pat Gagan. Pat and Nuala Gagan are members of Kappa Farmers Group, and as I say, they have been fighting for environmental justice for 3 decades. And this decision by An Bord Pleanála to fast track the planning process for the extension of that huge residue of red mud is just another hammer blow to the people in the area that are saying that they are affected, their health is affected by it. But it wasn't all bad news on the environmental front. Last Friday, the court ruled that Cork Harbour Alliance for a Safe Environment, otherwise known as CHASE, is entitled to succeed on 2 of its 11 grounds of challenge to a fast track granting planning permission by An Bord Pleanála in May 2018. Mr. Justice David Banville was told on Tuesday the board does not intend to appeal the High Court decision from last Friday. CHASE Chairwoman Mary O'Leary said Friday's ruling was a huge community win. This is an enormous day in our 20-year campaign to stop the construction of this incinerator, and one that vindicates the efforts and the enormous cost on the part of all involved, she said. So the housing issue now is something that Finbar touched on at the beginning of the programme, and he outlined the huge increase in house prices that have taken place in the last number of years. And we're going to look now at a photograph that was posted to social media by Sleep Out Cavan. They are a group of volunteers, and I suppose this is a picture of the fallout of the housing and homeless crisis that you will not see documented on mainstream media. Irish Times columnist Fintan O'Toole wrote last Saturday that he was able to get a mortgage when he was a 24-year-old freelance journalist in the mid-1980s. And indeed, I myself was able to get my first mortgage when I was a 23-year-old student. My fiance and I were able to secure a mortgage from the Housing Finance Agency, and that mortgage came through Kildare County Council, and we were able to buy our own house in a private estate in Maynooth. But it looks like our young people today are not going to be able to do that. Fintan O'Toole noted that the percentage of 25 to 39-year-olds that own their own home has dropped from 22% in 2011 to 16% in 2016, and it's now about 12%. The homeless activist Father Peter McVerry was interviewed last Friday night by Tommy Tiernan, and when Tommy asked him why we have a homeless and housing crisis, Father McVerry responded immediately by saying that it's due to the failure of local authorities to build social houses. And he pointed out that 8,500 council houses were built in Dublin in 1975. 6,000 in 1985, and only 75 council houses were built in 2015. And if we look at the latest data from the Housing Agency, it shows that approximately 2,000 council houses were built in the entire country in 2019, and that the vast bulk of social housing needs are now being met by HAP. But local authorities have now started to enter into leasing arrangements for social houses. The councils don't own the properties after the lease expires, and they must then enter into another leasing arrangement, making them a very costly proposition. And in Sunday's Business Post, Killian Woods reports that in November 2019, Dunleary-Rathdown County Council signed a 25-year lease on 87 apartments in the new Herbert Hill apartment complex in Dundrum to be used as social housing. And they didn't seek an independent valuation on the units, €2,000 for a month for a one-bedroom apartment, €2,500 a month for a two-bedroom unit, and €3,000 a month for a three-bedroom unit. And the leasing agreement that the council have entered into is going to cost them in the region of €2.1 million a year. Now, the apartments were built by Glenveagh Properties and were sold to a German real estate investment trust in 2019 for €55 million. And by the end of the leasing arrangement, the Germans will have recouped all of their outlay and still own the apartment block. So our young people today, unlike myself or Fintan O'Toole, are not able to get their foot on the property ladder. They're going to have to rent all of their lives, and then when they retire, their pension is not going to be able to cover the cost of their rent. So we're storing up massive problems for the future. And effectively what we are creating at the moment is a two-tier society. Those who own their own home and those who don't. And I suppose we're creating a two-tier society on a number of different fronts. And I suppose another of these fronts is a two-tier society being created between those who are vaccinated and those who are not vaccinated. And the government are currently on holidays and won't be back until next week. And when they do come back, it will be only for 2 days a week. But nevertheless, Minister Stephen Donnelly took a break from his holidays last weekend to sign statutory instrument number 168 into law, creating for the first time ever a two-tier society with special privileges for those who are vaccinated against COVID-19. Since Monday last, people who are vaccinated can visit each other's houses. So that is my weekly roundup of the news. I want to thank you very much for watching, and I'm going to leave you now with a question to ponder. We saw that since last Monday, people who are vaccinated can visit each other's homes. And the question now that I want you to consider for the next few days is, will the Gardaí be going into people's houses to see if the visitors are vaccinated or not vaccinated?
That's an interesting question, Anna. I'm not sure if there would be an appetite on the part of Gardaí Síochána to test their powers in that regard. We are way over our time. We've covered so many news stories tonight from around the world and locally in Ireland. I'd like to thank Stephen Kerr and Danny in our Dublin studio. I'd like to thank Independent Republican Councillor Gary Donnelly and pro-union community worker Brian Dougherty for our discussion on the recent street violence in the north of Ireland. I'd like to thank Anna Kavanagh for our Joining the Dots segment, which is going to be a regular feature on the show, a permanent feature on the show now. And I'd like to thank Stephen McDowell here in our Dundalk studio as well, and anybody else who's contributed over the last few weeks. Join us next week for Double Down at 9 p.m. on Thursday. Until then, be safe, be as happy as you can, and be as free as you can. Good night.